Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 65. I'm Enigmius and today we're continuing with the Chariot build. You can see it just booted us out. We got to a point with this section that we've been working on. We've been working on a lot of different transitions, a lot of different angles and curves coming together, and there were eventually too many compromises. I felt there were too many decisions that I was making that was leading me away from what I wanted it to be. So I decided that it would be a good idea before we get too much farther to just start over. And there's always, I've mentioned this in the past, whenever we get to a point where it comes time to scrap a large section of a ship because I'm not happy with it, there's the dilemma of, do I show the process, get rid of everything, start over, talk about what we did differently this time around, or do we just get rid of all the stuff, rebuild it, try and get caught up to where we were, and then just carry on from there and sort of not spend a whole lot of time on the rework. And in this case, I decided that there was enough going on that it made sense to look at what we're going to do differently so that we get a better outcome this time around. And you saw the first thing that we did was we removed all of the things that we needed to remove. And you saw also in the very beginning, I tried removing so many pieces that the game said, to hell with you, and kicked me out. And I had to go back in. And when I got back in, the pieces that I had said to delete were gone, but it was just, I guess, too much for the game to handle. It's very unhappy with me. So now what I'm doing is I'm trying to place hologram blocks that will basically define the profile that I'm looking for in behind that large section that we cut and paste from the front of the ship. And this is sort of where I ran into trouble and where I realized that I was just making too many compromises and I wasn't really happy with the results that I was getting from them. Was I started from the larger section of the ship and working towards that cut and paste profile with the idea that we would have everything sort of come together and it would flatten out and go in behind that profile and everything eventually would work out and it would be fine. And that wound up being not the case at all. It was trying to get things to flow, trying to get certain shapes and things to just kind of come together in a way that looks natural, put us in a position where the profile that we were trying to achieve wasn't possible. It was always kind of going a little bit wonky. Eventually, when we got to the point towards the end of the last episode there, where we had very large sections of the back portion of the ship behind that profile, or actually behind the profile, you couldn't see them from the side of the ship. And that was not at all what I really had in mind. And after looking at it for a little while and trying to decide how to go about closing everything off and finishing everything, I just decided it would be best to start over. So we use the hologram blocks to define the profile that we're looking for as it relates to this piece that we cut and paste from the front. And now we're going around and we're focusing first on getting this profile in place, and then we'll wrap it around to meet the rest of the ship as it's possible once we get all of this done. And the interesting thing about this, doing it this way, ideally I would have thought of doing it this way from the very beginning, saved a little bit of time, but I didn't. I thought of it now. The benefit of doing it this way is that, with the exception of where this piece that we're adding on now is going to intersect with the top piece that we've already got in place, we can do basically whatever we want with this shape and have it work out swimmingly. We won't have very many areas where we specifically have to line up and intersect with existing parts of the ship, because we're starting from the most difficult part to try and make everything come together and building out from there. Building out from something is easy. It's building towards something that gets a little bit crazy and a little bit complicated at times if we've got a lot of different shapes and profiles that we're working with. So I had to remove the hangar in order to be able to place the hologram blocks so that I could lay out the profile for what we were trying to accomplish. And then once I got some blocks in place, you can see the ones that we're interacting with now, to outline the profile in sort of a final stage, then I could remove the hologram blocks. I replaced the hangar, and now we're in a good spot where we can just kind of build our way towards the this cut and paste profile from the front. It won't take too long before we get everything caught up, and then we'll be able to kind of move on from here. But the key in this entire process was, first of all, making the decision that we crossed a certain threshold with the number of compromises that we were making in order to try and move ahead with the build. And sometimes the hardest decision is the one to go back and start over a particular section, just because you've already invested a certain amount of time. It's sort of like the whole idea of the sunk cost fallacy. If you've ever heard of this before, it's the kind of thing where you get involved in a project. Usually they're talking about money, but it can be time, it can be effort, it can be money, it can be whatever. But you get invested in something. You've already put in a certain amount of money or a certain amount of time, and you decide you have to keep going with it, because if you don't, then everything that you put into it up to this point will have been wasted. It will have been for nothing. And that's the sunk cost fallacy. That's the justification for continuing, is because you've already invested so much. And it's quite often the wrong approach. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop or change course before moving on, either to continue the project or to abandon the project altogether, and not worry about what you've invested, because it doesn't, making the decision to continue on when you're already invested but you're not happy with where you are, doesn't mean that you're going to be happy eventually. It just means you're going to continue investing until it ends and you're not happy with it. Maybe you will be happy with it, but realistically, if you're not happy with it halfway through and it's kind of bugging you and you're thinking about abandoning it, that's usually the time to abandon it. Just cut your losses and run, so to speak. So we've got this new approach that we're using, building out instead of building towards. And a lot of this, at this point now, you can see we're working this specific contour fairly aggressively and over again. And it's trying to get the blocks that are defining that contour the right thickness, so that we can fill in this area in behind. You can see where we're working now, and not have it overlap so much with the blocks that are already there that we get this red saying, no, you can't build there because you've got too much overlap. I've been trying, and I've been making a genuine effort to get the hologram thing to work. It's worked for me in the past, and now, for whatever reason, the game doesn't care. The game doesn't care if you're building with holograms or if you're building with solid blocks. If it says you're overlapping too much, you're overlapping too much, and there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, this came together fairly quickly. This part here, once we got the profile in place, and then we got some blocks to define that profile with the actual finished sort of thing, closing in this back section, getting to work it up and around the hangar, and then putting ourselves in a position where we can continue on and start actually building it out as a 3D structure that will eventually intersect where it needs to intersect and do what it needs to do. It's fairly quick and easy, being that we've set ourselves up with this particular method fairly well. It doesn't, well, aside from this business of trying to get the blocks the right thickness and lined up properly, it doesn't take much to get everything sort of in place and where we want it. The key that I had, the main consideration, is that I wanted this piece that we're working on now, essentially the main structural component of this rear part of the ship, is that it would be flat, and then the cut and paste piece would look like it was attached to the side, and then there would be a little bit of a flat exposure around the entire profile that you can see. And based on that, we would be able to then, you know, once we've got that flat profile in place, then we can start to curve and do whatever we want to do in order to get the shape that we're looking for. And because we've got that plan that we went into ahead of time and sort of set ourselves up with the right profile, got everything going, it's going together rather quickly. And I'm very pleased at this point with how it's going together. Now, the actual process of then expanding this profile so that it starts to wrap around and go the places that it needs to go gets a little bit more complicated, just because usually if I'm in a situation where I've made a bunch of compromises and it's resulted in me having to start over a significant portion of the build, I kind of get to a place where the things that I do immediately after that, I'm a lot less willing to compromise. It's almost like a no tolerance kind of policy, just because, you know, we got ourselves into trouble with compromises immediately before. We don't necessarily want to jump in and keep making the same mistakes. So the process of getting everything to work together is going to take a little bit longer. And so I've decided that what we'll do in the next episode is we'll basically finish off the back end. It's not necessarily going to be block for block, because the important stuff, the things that are different with what we're doing here, are being shown to you right now, and the actual process of then extending them around. Be good if you can see the key parts of it, but not necessarily. I don't expect anyone is going to be thrilled about watching block for block, basically redoing what we had already done. So we're going to try and get everything set up in a way so that you can see the important parts, but by the end of the next video, we'll be caught up. The back end will basically, the structural elements will be done, and then we can go on about finishing off the other structural. There's just a few more structural details we need to worry about, specifically the spine that goes across the top of the ship. We just have to finish off a little bit of that. The sides of these profiles that we've got, the one that we cut and paste on the back end and the original that's on the front end, we have to finish those off. And then we can look at doing some of the aesthetic detailing, looking at some of there were a couple of creases that I've talked about that just didn't really line up the way I would have liked them to, and thinking about ways that we can make them look a little less unrefined, I guess we could say. We'll take care of those sorts of little details, and then hopefully we'll be in a position where we can sort of fire this thing up, get some crew on board, get some fighters under construction. I'll have to go to a shipyard, I think, to get the first one, and then get the blueprint and have it producing fighters, and a lot of fighters that this thing needs to produce in order to fill out the hangar, but we'll see how that works out. I'm starting to think that if we really want to get the most out of this thing, we're going to need a lot more crew quarters so that we can have all of the pilots on board that we need to man the fighters in order to take advantage of the maximum quantity of fighters that were allowed based on the size of the hangar. So there's decisions to be made in the tuning department of the ship once it's complete, in order to get it up and running and producing and ready to do its job. And then once we've got that sort of squared away, then we'll be moving on to the next ship in our fleet of ships that we're going to be producing. And it'll be some sort of heavy support, like battleship or destroyer or something like that. I'll have to look into the different categories or classifications of ships to make sure that I'm naming things appropriately and not abusing the terminology willy-nilly, because some people just really don't appreciate that sort of thing. So, having said all that, we're in a good spot. I'm happy with the way that it's moving forward now. I don't feel like we've made any compromises up to this point for this particular section of the ship. So the next episode should be, hopefully we'll be covering a lot of ground. So if you want to be notified about that episode and other episodes in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel and or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.